Has Christianity always been a cult religion? Today I'm going to look at this question with a particular focus on the early Christian movement as described in the book of Acts. It's a pretty big question, so I'd love to hear some arguments for and against this in the comments section below. Now, first of all, I want to speak briefly about the word cult itself. At the simplest level, the word cult simply means any group of people that are bound together by a common focus, which means the word could be used to describe anything from a sporting club to a cult following of a personality, or even people who are all devoted to the one restaurant. I refer to this usage of the word cult as being a cult with a little c. And certainly, by this definition alone, early Christianity could be defined as a cult religion. However, things become a little bit more nuanced when you consider that the stereotype of a cult represented as a group of people with bizarre beliefs, with a charismatic leader, causes harm to their followers or society. At the extreme end, examples of this type of cult are Jim Jones and Dave Koresh, and the most infamous of all in Australia, The Family. I refer to these types of destructive groups as being cults with a big C. In between these two extremes are many varying levels of how a group could be defined in terms of cultic behaviour. To help work out whether or not a group is a cult with a little c or a cult with a big C, I've devised a rubric that has 12 features of coercive control that I like to use to help form my own personal opinions of whether or not a group is harmful or not. And it is through this rubric and those 12 criteria that I'm going to evaluate the early Christians as described in the book of Acts. Before jumping straight into it, I'll do a brief summary of what is written in this part of the Christian Bible. It begins with the Holy Spirit descending upon Jesus' followers at Pentecost, enabling them to speak in various languages and share the gospel with people from different regions. This event ignites the church's rapid growth as Peter and the apostles boldly preach about Jesus, gathering thousands of new believers in Jerusalem. They form a tight-knit community devoted to prayer, sharing resources, and observing teachers together, becoming known as the Way. Persecution soon arises, scattering believers beyond Jerusalem, and the gospel spreads through its cities across the Roman Empire. Key figures like Philip, Stephen, Peter, and later Paul become central to its expansion. Okay, now let's start looking at the early Christian community through 12 features of coercive control. Authoritative leadership. After Jesus' death, his apostles, particularly Paul and John, assumed leadership of the early Christian community. Baptism marked a person's formal entry into the group, signalling a commitment to the group's beliefs. Devoted followers respected the authority, but was it absolute? The Bible doesn't provide a detailed historical record, but it does suggest that the apostles had significant influence. I would rate the early Christian church as a 2 or a 3. While the apostles held considerable authority, the community wasn't fully autocratic. Authoritative leadership is really only a concern if it's combined with other harmful behaviours. So let's move on to the other features. Next up is control over information. Today, this could mean restricting access to information, censoring opposing views, or filtering what members hear about the outside world. But in the early Christian era, most people couldn't read or write, and communication was limited to spoken words and letters. So did the apostles restrict what people could say or discuss? We don't have any clear evidence of this, so without more data, I would rate this feature as being inconclusive. Now let's look at deception. Deceptive groups often mislead people during recruitment or hide key details about the group's true beliefs and practices. Did the early Christian community deceive people to get them to join? There's really not enough information in historical texts to say this for sure. Without specific instances of lies and manipulation, I think this criteria is also inconclusive. Exclusive knowledge is a little bit easier to evaluate. The early Christians certainly believed that they had access to unique insights about God, salvation, and the afterlife that others did not. Jesus' teachings were seen as a new and exclusive path to God, which set the early Christians apart from the broader Jewish and Roman society. I would rate this criteria at a 3. Believing in exclusive knowledge isn't necessarily harmful in itself, but it becomes an issue if it is combined with deception and control over information. Now, exploitation. Early Christians practiced communal living, and members were expected to contribute their money and possessions for the group's common good, often laying them at the apostles' feet. This practice might look like financial exploitation by today's standards, where we tend to view individual ownership as the norm. However, communal living was more common and sometimes necessary in the ancient world to access resources. If people joined freely and could leave without consequences, this might not have been considered exploitative. I would rate this as a 1 or a 2, depending on how much pressure members felt to give up their possessions. Moving on to fear, guilt, and intimidation. There is a well-known story in the Acts of the Apostles where Anytus and Sapphira, a couple who withheld part of their wealth from the apostles, suddenly died. Whether they died from guilt or divine intervention, the story would have instilled some level of fear within the community to ensure obedience. While it's not clear if this was a regular tactic, the story suggests that fear may have been used to maintain group norms. I'd rate this at a level 2, since fear was present but not necessarily a persuasive part of everyday life within the group. Now let's discuss isolation. In early Christianity, members did live closely together, but they weren't forced to cut ties with outsiders. This isolation was mostly circumstantial and voluntary, rather than forced by leadership. So I would rate this as a 1, which indicates a close-knit community rather than a fully isolated one. Management of daily tasks is our next feature. This often involves leaders directing members' daily routines, from what they can eat and where they can sleep or pray. In early Christian community, it seems people had the freedom to organise their own lives. I would rate this a 0 or 1. While members were encouraged to participate in community activities, there's no evidence that the leadership dictated their personal activities or lifestyles in a coercive way. Then we have monitoring thoughts and/or behaviours. In some modern cults, leaders survey members, checking on private messages, emails, and even journals. The early Christian community, however, didn't have the technology for such monitoring, and there's no record of leaders strictly enforcing beliefs or behaviours on a personal level. Again, I would rate this as a 0. Without evidence of close monitoring, we can assume that members had some degree of freedom in their thoughts and personal actions. Next is punishment and discipline. In modern cults, this can mean anything from forced labour to social shaming. In early Christianity, the strongest example we have of potential discipline is the story of Ananias and Sapphira, who died after withholding money. This incident suggests that discipline may have been enforced through religious teachings or stories that highlighted consequences for disobedience. I would rate this as a 1. There's no indication that physical punishment or harsh discipline was a routine part of community life. Next is thought reform or systemic indoctrination. This is when a group uses intense psychological pressure to make members conform. In early Christianity, new converts were baptized and taught the faith, but there's no evidence of coercive techniques like isolation, sleep deprivation, or forced confession. I would rate this at a 1, indicating that while there was some pressure to accept and conform to the beliefs, it didn't reach a level of intense indoctrination through coercive practices. And finally, we have the us versus them mentality. This mindset can be a key feature of cults, where members see themselves as uniquely righteous and everyone else is misguided or sinful. Early Christians did see themselves as separate from the rest of society, often emphasising that they had special knowledge and a different path to salvation. I would rate this at number 2, since the sense of separation was quite strong, although it didn't necessarily imply hostility towards others. As Christianity developed, the sense of us versus them intensified. Ironically, I think that once Christianity actually became Romanized under Emperor Constantine, that's when the strongest sense of us versus them within the Christian faith really emerged in full force. From what we know, early Christianity that may be considered concerning by today's standards, particularly in terms of authoritative leadership and exclusive knowledge. However, when we look at it as a whole, it doesn't necessarily fit the criteria of a destructive cult. Depending on which way the variables swing, overall, I would rank early Christianity as described in the book of Acts as falling somewhere between a level 3 or a level 5. which indicates that it had cultic features, but it wasn't necessarily harmful. Really, whether or not early Christianity is to be considered a cult with a big C all comes down to considering the 12 features that I've mentioned within historical context. Remembering things like we're talking about an era in which slavery was normal and legal, and women were considered to be the property of men. I also believe it's important to remember that early Christianity was very complex and diverse. It encompassed a wide variety of different schools of thought and beliefs, each with its own unique features and traditions and interpretations of Jesus' teachings. The point to remember here is that the story of early Christianity in the book of Acts is not the full picture. If you'd like to have a closer look at the rubric that I've gone through to assess early Christianity, I encourage you to look at my website, and in future videos I hope to examine more aspects of early Christianity according to those 12 features of coercive control. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and share with others.